Atlas, the 430-pound silverback, pressed one ear against the concrete drainage curb and went completely still while nearly 50 zoo visitors stood less than 30 feet away wondering why he had abandoned his breakfast. His knuckles rested in the grass, his shoulders rigid, but he wasn't watching the crowd. He wasn't watching the keepers either. He was listening to something beneath them. Then he moved 6 feet to his left, lowered his head again, and placed his ear against the ground. Senior Keeper Mason Reed stopped beside the service gate with a bucket still in his hand. Atlas had ignored the apple slices scattered behind him, something Mason had rarely seen him do. A stroller rolled past the viewing glass. Children argued over whose turn it was to use the binoculars. Somewhere near the snack stand, a blender started whining. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon at the wildlife park, except Atlas kept tracing the same narrow strip of ground as though something invisible were moving underneath it. Mason raised a hand toward another keeper, signaling her not to approach yet. Atlas took 3 slow steps, stopped, and touched the curb with the back of his fingers. Then came 3 faint taps. Mason frowned. The sound hadn't come from Atlas. He crouched on the public side of the barrier and listened, but the noise disappeared beneath the crowd. For several seconds Atlas remained motionless. Then his head snapped toward a maintenance corridor beyond the viewing area. A moment later, he crossed the habitat quickly and struck the metal access panel once with an open palm. The sharp clang silenced the nearest visitors. Parents pulled their children closer. Mason immediately asked everyone to move back from the glass. Atlas didn't follow them with his eyes. Instead, he returned to the curb and began moving alongside it, stopping every few feet as if trying to keep pace with something Mason couldn't see. That was when veterinarian Claire Bennett arrived from the clinic. She watched Atlas without speaking. His movements were tense, but they didn't fit the simple picture forming in the crowd. He wasn't displaying toward the visitors. He wasn't challenging another gorilla. Each time the noise level dropped, Atlas lowered his head again. Claire glanced toward Mason. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Mason did now. A dull metallic sound, barely audible, came from somewhere beyond the enclosure wall. Once. Then nothing. Atlas reacted before either of them could locate it. He rushed toward the far corner, where a locked service door separated the habitat boundary from an employee passage. The crowd recoiled. A security officer reached for his radio. Mason felt his own pulse quicken because Atlas wasn't slowing down. Yet instead of striking the door, the silverback stopped inches from it and crouched. He pushed his fingers into the grass beneath the frame and released a low, short vocalization. Claire looked toward the visitor walkway. Something else had changed. A woman named Rachel Parker was moving against the flow of people, checking behind benches and calling, "Noah." Her voice was controlled at first, the way a parent sounds when she assumes her child has wandered only a few yards. She checked near the restroom entrance, then beneath the shade structure. "Noah." This time the name came out louder. Mason turned toward her, but Atlas made another sound from inside the habitat, pulling his attention back. The gorilla had risen and was staring through the narrow gap beside the service door. Rachel reached a staff member and said her 8-year-old son had been beside her less than 2 minutes earlier. The employee immediately called security. Mason looked from Rachel to Atlas, then toward the maintenance corridor Atlas had been tracking. For the first time, the two strange events seemed close enough to belong to the same story. Then Atlas did something that changed the mood completely. He ignored Mason's familiar recall signal, moved away from the service door, and followed the underground drainage line toward a grated opening near the back wall. He stopped directly above it. From somewhere below came a tiny scrape, followed by 2 unmistakable knocks. Atlas lowered his face toward the grate. Mason's radio crackled as a security officer reported that Noah wasn't anywhere on the public walkway. Then, beneath the noise of the radio, Mason heard what Atlas had apparently heard first, a child's voice, faint and muffled, coming from somewhere no visitor was supposed to be. The voice lasted barely a second, too soft for Mason to make out a word, but Atlas stayed beside the grate as if the sound had filled the entire enclosure. He did not pound the ground or rush the wall. He simply folded his arms beneath his chest and waited, his dark eyes fixed on the narrow slots in the metal. Mason had seen Atlas ignore shouting visitors, maintenance carts, even thunderstorms rolling across the park, yet a sound most people could barely hear had brought every part of him to stillness. Claire asked security to keep the nearby walkway quiet. As the crowd slowly moved back, Atlas picked up a thin piece of straw and pushed it toward one of the openings in the grate. It slipped through and vanished. He watched the empty space where it had been, then reached for another piece. Mason almost smiled despite the tension. Atlas often occupied himself with small objects, turning leaves between his fingers or carrying a smooth piece of bark until something else caught his attention. But this was different. He was not examining the straw. Each piece went through the same opening. 3 pieces disappeared below before Atlas stopped and tilted his head. From underneath came a faint rustling sound. His fingers immediately withdrew. For several seconds, nothing moved except the grass around his knuckles. Then Atlas picked up a yellow plastic enrichment cup that had been left near his feeding area. Normally he would turn it over, check it for treats, and abandon it once it was empty. This time he carried it across the enclosure and placed it beside the grate. Claire noticed the cup and quietly asked Mason why Atlas had brought it there. Mason had no answer. Atlas sat beside it with one hand resting on the rim, looking down instead of toward the keepers. Rachel was now standing behind the security line, clutching Noah's blue baseball cap against her chest. Someone had found it near the entrance to the maintenance corridor. She kept rubbing her thumb across the worn white stitching above the bill, staring whenever the radio came alive. Atlas could not see her clearly from where he sat, yet when Rachel called Noah's name again, his eyes lifted. He listened until her voice faded, then turned back to the grate. A few seconds later, the metal beneath him gave a tiny vibration. Atlas touched it with 2 fingers. There was something strangely gentle about the gesture, and Mason felt his concern deepen rather than ease. The silverback seemed less agitated now, but he was also refusing to leave. Even when Mason rolled one of Atlas's favorite wooden puzzle feeders into view, Atlas glanced at it only once. He usually knew the sound of that feeder before it appeared. Today, he let it sit untouched in the grass. Claire lowered her voice. He is choosing that spot over everything familiar. Mason nodded. That was exactly what bothered him. A security officer reported that staff had entered the service passage, but the corridor ended at a locked utility room. Noah was not there. Rachel covered her mouth. Atlas shifted closer to the grate and released another quiet vocalization, softer than before. A response came from below, but this time it was not a voice. It sounded like something lightweight dragging across concrete. Atlas leaned forward. His yellow cup tipped onto its side, and he calmly set it upright again before returning his attention to the opening. The small, almost ordinary movement made Mason pause. Atlas was not behaving like an animal trying to escape a stressful situation. He seemed prepared to remain exactly where he was. Minutes passed. The afternoon noise of the park continued farther away, but around the enclosure there was only the hum of ventilation equipment and occasional radio traffic. Then Atlas rose. He walked approximately 12 feet along the drainage line, stopped over a second grate hidden partly beneath tall grass, and brushed the grass aside with one hand. Mason had never seen him pay attention to that grate before. Atlas lowered his head. A dull knock sounded underneath it. Then another answered from beneath the first grate behind him. Atlas turned from one opening to the other. Mason felt the skin on his arms tighten. Whatever was below them was no longer in one place. It was moving. Atlas moved before Mason could radio the change. Instead of following the drainage line again, the silverback crossed to a shallow patch of loose mulch near the second grate and began sweeping it aside with the edge of his hand. He worked without hurry, clearing a strip about 2 feet wide until a narrow concrete seam appeared beneath the mulch. Mason had walked past that spot hundreds of times without noticing it. Atlas traced the seam for several inches, stopped where it met the enclosure wall, and pressed his knuckles against the concrete. A vibration hummed through the ground. Atlas immediately stepped away. That changed Mason's first assumption. The gorilla was not simply following a sound. He appeared to be reacting to something traveling through the structure itself. Claire crouched outside the barrier and placed her palm against the concrete. She felt nothing. A maintenance worker arrived carrying a flashlight and a folded utility map. He explained that the drainage channel should run straight toward a collection basin behind the service building. Atlas seemed to contradict him. He crossed diagonally toward a cluster of rocks, pulled a loose branch from the grass, and slid its narrow end into a gap near the base of the wall. He withdrew it, sniffed the end briefly, then dropped it. Mason looked at the map again. There was no marked drain beneath those rocks. Now the question was no longer where the sound was moving. It was whether the map showed everything beneath them. Security kept searching the public areas while another employee checked access doors. Rachel remained nearby, answering questions about Noah's clothes, height, and the last place she remembered seeing him. Atlas began doing something Mason had never seen during an ordinary afternoon. He moved between 3 separate points in a repeating sequence: the hidden grate, the concrete seam, then the rocks. At each location he paused differently. At the grate he listened. At the seam he touched the ground. At the rocks he tested the narrow gap with his fingers. It looked almost systematic, yet Mason refused to assign human intention to it. Animals noticed patterns people missed all the time. What troubled him was that Atlas abruptly abandoned the sequence after the ventilation system switched on. A low mechanical hum traveled beneath the enclosure, and the silverback moved uphill instead. Claire noticed the timing. She asked maintenance to shut the ventilation fan off for 30 seconds. The hum faded. Atlas froze halfway across the grass, turned, and returned directly to the rocks. When the fan restarted, he backed away again. Mason now wondered whether the machinery was masking whatever Atlas had been detecting. Maintenance agreed to leave the fan off temporarily. The enclosure became unusually quiet. Atlas lowered himself near the wall, but rather than listening at the ground, he raised his face toward a narrow vent roughly 4 feet above the concrete. A small draft stirred the hair along his forehead. Then something pale fluttered behind the vent cover. Mason first thought it was paper. Atlas reached toward it but stopped before touching the metal. The object disappeared. Seconds later, a soft scraping noise traveled from behind the wall toward the second grate. Claire called for the maintenance supervisor. The utility map was unfolded across the hood of a nearby cart. There should have been solid fill behind that section of wall. No passage. No accessible chamber. Nothing large enough for a person. Yet Atlas had begun shifting his attention between the vent and the ground below it. Then the strangest pattern appeared. He picked up the yellow enrichment cup, carried it to the vent, and set it beneath the opening. Next he retrieved the wooden puzzle feeder Mason had offered earlier and placed that beside the cup. Finally, he dragged a short section of hollow enrichment tubing across the grass and laid it against the wall. 3 familiar objects, gathered from 3 different parts of the habitat, all arranged beneath the same vent. Mason could not understand why. Atlas stepped back, glanced toward the keepers, then toward the vent. A faint sound came through the metal cover. Atlas immediately picked up the hollow tube, raised one end toward the opening, and held it there. From the other end came a small, unmistakable sound that made every staff member nearby stop talking. Someone on the unseen side had tapped the tube. The tap traveled through the hollow tube so clearly that Mason instinctively reached for it, but Atlas pulled the tube closer to his chest and moved back from the wall. That single motion changed the problem. The staff could no longer treat the enclosure as part of the search area while Atlas remained beside the utility wall. If maintenance needed to open anything behind it, the gorilla would have to be shifted into his indoor holding space first. It was standard procedure, and Mason knew exactly why it existed. He also knew Atlas had spent nearly an hour refusing to leave this particular section of ground. Claire quietly suggested a voluntary shift. Mason agreed. No force, no rushing, just the routine Atlas knew. He opened the interior access door and placed a few familiar food items inside the holding area. Usually the sound of that door was enough to bring Atlas over to investigate. This time Atlas glanced toward it, then lowered the tube beside the vent again. Another faint tap came through. His fingers closed around the tube. Mason felt a knot form in his stomach. Atlas was choosing the wall over a routine he had followed for years. Still, the maintenance crew could not safely inspect the structure with him there. Mason gave the familiar shift cue and waited. Atlas stood, walked halfway toward the indoor door, and for one hopeful moment Mason thought the problem had solved itself. Then Atlas stopped. He turned back, collected the yellow cup from beneath the vent, carried it to the grate, and set it down with unusual care. Only after doing that did he walk toward Mason again. Claire noticed immediately. "He left it there," she said. Mason did not answer. The cup had no food in it, yet Atlas had returned it to the same place twice. Before Mason could give another cue, a maintenance employee approached with new information. The old utility plans showed a narrow stormwater inspection channel beneath the habitat, sealed from public access years earlier. It was not designed as a walkway, and the current map did not include its full route. That meant the sounds might have a physical explanation after all. It also made moving Atlas more urgent. Workers needed access to the service wall before anyone could determine whether the channel connected to the area where Noah had disappeared. Rachel heard enough of the conversation to understand that possibility. She did not interrupt. She simply held Noah's cap tighter and watched Atlas. Mason gave the shift cue again. Atlas entered the holding doorway, but before crossing completely inside, he looked back toward the grate. A soft knock came from below. He immediately reversed direction. The automatic door remained open, but Atlas returned to the wall and sat beside the yellow cup. No display. No panic. Just refusal. That made the decision harder, not easier. Claire reminded Mason that prolonged stress could make Atlas increasingly difficult to shift, especially with unfamiliar workers and equipment gathering nearby. Waiting indefinitely was not fair to the animal, and it could delay the search. Mason knew she was right. The safest choice for everyone, including Atlas, was to secure him indoors and let the maintenance team work. Yet when Mason approached the control panel, Atlas picked up the cup and pushed it against the grate. Something underneath scraped once, very close now. Mason stopped with his hand above the switch. For several seconds, Atlas held the cup there. Then the cup moved. Not much, perhaps half an inch, but enough for Claire to see it too. Something below had touched the bottom through the narrow opening. A security officer called over the radio that search team still had no visual contact with Noah. Mason looked at the grate, then at the gathering maintenance crew. There was no more time to interpret Atlas's behavior. The service wall had to be opened, and procedure could not be ignored. Mason gave the shift cue one final time. Atlas remained beside the grate. Claire quietly authorized the next step: the habitat would be cleared, Atlas would be moved into the secure indoor suite under veterinary supervision, and the exterior access would stay locked until the underground search was finished. Once that process began, Atlas would not be allowed back near the drainage line. Mason closed his eyes for a moment, then confirmed the decision over the radio. Atlas was guided into the indoor suite only after Mason changed the routine. Instead of calling him away from the wall again, Mason opened the connecting door and left the choice quiet. Atlas remained beside the grate for almost a minute, then rose and carried the hollow tube with him. He left the yellow cup behind. Once the secure door closed, the maintenance crew entered the service zone with flashlights, a portable inspection camera, and the old utility plan spread across a rolling cart. Their first discovery seemed disappointing. The channel beneath the second grate was barely 18 inches high, far too narrow for an adult to move through comfortably. Then one worker noticed fresh dust along the concrete edge, as though something had disturbed a surface that had been untouched for years. The inspection camera went in first. Its small light showed damp concrete, leaves, and an old plastic bottle lodged near a bend. Nothing moved. The channel appeared to end roughly 20 feet ahead where debris blocked the view. That weakened the idea that someone had simply walked through it. Yet when the worker began pulling the camera back, its microphone picked up 3 soft sounds separated by uneven pauses. Mason heard them through the monitor speaker. They did not resemble the steady vibration of machinery. Claire asked the worker to stop moving the camera. Everyone listened. Nothing followed. From inside the holding suite, however, Atlas became alert at almost the same moment. He carried the hollow tube to the mesh partition and held it there, turning one end slowly between his fingers. Mason looked from Atlas to the monitor. Whatever had caught the gorilla's attention had not disappeared when he was moved indoors. Maintenance shifted to the exterior service corridor, where the original plans showed an old runoff junction beneath a locked utility room. The room itself contained nothing unusual: cleaning supplies, spare hoses, electrical panels, and a floor drain covered by a heavy steel plate. But the plate was newer than the surrounding concrete. A supervisor checked the maintenance records and found that it had been replaced during drainage work several years earlier. No one on the current crew knew what lay directly beneath it. That gave them another possible route, although not necessarily one connected to Noah. Rachel stood outside with a security officer while staff reviewed camera footage from the public walkway. One recording showed Noah near his mother. Another showed a tour group passing between them. In the next clear frame, Noah was gone. There was no image of him entering the employee corridor. For a moment, the entire underground theory seemed weaker. Then Mason noticed something near the bottom of the video. A small white object rolled across the pavement shortly after Noah disappeared from view. Security enlarged the frame. It was not part of his clothing. It looked like a disposable paper cup, pushed along by a gust of wind toward a narrow opening beneath a temporary construction barrier. Workers checked the same location outside. Behind the barrier was a shallow landscaped strip and an old storm drain hidden under decorative gravel. The drain cover was secure, but one corner had settled lower than the others. A flashlight revealed scuff marks in the dust nearby, though nobody could tell how recent they were. Mason radioed Claire. She was still watching Atlas through the holding room window. The gorilla had stopped handling the tube. He was sitting close to the floor vent now, occasionally shifting his head as air moved through it. Claire asked maintenance whether the indoor ventilation shared any space with the stormwater system. The supervisor said it should not. Then he hesitated and pulled out an older blueprint from the bottom of the folder. A renovation decades earlier had placed two separate utility channels within several feet of each other before later construction covered portions of both. They were not supposed to connect. The word "supposed" changed the room. Mason returned to the service wall while a worker fed the inspection camera deeper beneath the drain. At 23 feet, the lens reached the debris pile. Twigs and leaves filled most of the screen, but something bright appeared behind them. The worker adjusted the light. It was a small strip of blue fabric caught on a rough concrete edge. Rachel had said Noah was wearing a gray sweatshirt. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Mason remembered the blue baseball cap in her hands and nearly dismissed the fabric as part of it. But security still had the cap upstairs, completely intact. Claire called from the holding suite before Mason could respond. Atlas had placed the hollow tube on the floor and was no longer listening to the vent. Instead, he had turned toward the far wall of the room. At its base was an ordinary metal air return. Resting against the inside of its grill was a single piece of straw, the same kind Atlas had pushed through the outdoor grate earlier. The piece of straw against the air return changed everything. Mason asked the maintenance supervisor to compare the oldest blueprint with the current ventilation plan, and this time they stopped looking at the channels as separate systems. Beneath decades of renovations was a forgotten junction, not a usable passage, but a narrow service cavity where the old stormwater channel crossed beneath an abandoned ventilation chase. Air could travel between them through gaps left around utility conduits. Sound could travel with it. So could something as light as straw. Claire looked through the holding room window at Atlas. He had not been tracking a person moving freely beneath the habitat. He had been following sound and vibration as they shifted through connected concrete spaces. The mystery of his changing locations suddenly made sense. The first grate carried sound from below. The concrete seam carried vibration. The rocks covered part of the old utility line. When the ventilation fan started, it masked the weaker sounds and pushed air through a different route, which was why Atlas moved uphill. When maintenance turned the fan off, he returned to the wall. Even the hollow tube had amplified the tapping. Atlas had never changed what he was doing. The humans had changed their explanation for it. Mason radioed the search team and told them to inspect the storm drain behind the temporary construction barrier, but not from the public entrance. The old blueprint showed an access hatch 70 yards away, behind a maintenance shed. Workers opened it and lowered a camera carefully into the channel. 20 feet in, the passage narrowed. 30 feet in, they found the blue fabric. Then the camera turned around a concrete bend and stopped. A small sneaker appeared at the edge of the screen. Noah was there. He had slipped through the settled corner beside the construction barrier and ended up in the old runoff channel, where the bend and debris had hidden him from every opening the staff had checked. He was frightened and exhausted, but he answered when the rescue worker called his name. The channel was too confined for staff to rush in blindly, so the team followed the access plan, cleared the reachable obstruction, and guided Noah toward the maintenance hatch while Rachel waited above with a park medic. Mason remained near the habitat, listening to updates through his radio. Only then did he understand the yellow cup. Atlas had pushed straw through the grate, and movement below had apparently disturbed it. Later he placed objects near openings where sounds returned. There was no need to imagine that he understood drains, blueprints, or rescue. He had simply detected faint noises, vibrations, and movement in a place where none normally existed, then kept investigating them despite every attempt to redirect him. His senses had found the problem before the people knew where to look. When the radio finally announced that Noah was out of the channel and responsive, Rachel folded around her son on the pavement, one hand holding the back of his gray sweatshirt while the other still clutched his blue cap. Nobody cheered. The relief was quieter than that. Claire leaned against the service wall and closed her eyes for a moment. Mason walked back to the indoor suite. Atlas was sitting beside the air return, the hollow tube resting near his feet. The moment the activity outside settled, his posture changed. His shoulders loosened. He picked up the tube, turned it once in his hands, and set it aside. Then he walked to the mesh and sat across from Mason. Mason lowered himself onto the concrete on the other side. For nearly a minute, neither moved. Through his radio came Rachel's trembling voice asking someone to tell the keepers thank you. Mason looked at Atlas and remembered every cue the gorilla had refused, every place he had returned to, every ordinary object he had carried toward a sound no one else understood. Atlas had not become something different that afternoon. He had been consistent from the first moment. Mason was the one who had finally caught up. On the floor between them, a single piece of straw shifted gently in the air from the vent, and Atlas watched it settle. For several minutes after Noah was brought into the open, Atlas remained beside the air return as the sounds outside changed from hurried radio calls to quieter voices. Mason stayed seated across the mesh. He kept thinking about the moment he had confirmed the order to move Atlas away from the drainage line. The decision had been reasonable. It had also taken Atlas away from the one place he had refused to abandon. Mason rubbed his thumb across the edge of his radio and finally said, almost too quietly for Claire to hear, "You were trying to tell us where to listen." Atlas did not react to the words. He reached down, picked up the hollow tube, and rolled it once beneath his palm. Claire came to stand beside Mason carrying the yellow enrichment cup. Maintenance had recovered it from the outdoor grate after the search ended. A thin line of gray dust marked one side, and a piece of damp straw clung to the bottom. Claire held it for a moment before passing it through the keeper access slot. Atlas took the cup, examined the dusty edge, then placed it beside the tube. Mason watched the two ordinary objects sitting together on the concrete. Earlier that afternoon, he had treated them as meaningless distractions. Now he could not look at either one without remembering the faint tapping beneath the habitat. Outside, Rachel had finally managed to get Noah's blue cap back onto his head. It sat crooked because he refused to release her hand long enough for her to straighten it. A medic wrapped a light blanket around his shoulders while security finished taking notes. When Mason stepped outside briefly, Rachel walked toward him but stopped before reaching the staff gate. She looked past him toward the building where Atlas was being kept. "Is he okay?" she asked. Mason had expected questions about the drain, the search, or how Noah had been found. Instead, her first question was about Atlas. Mason nodded. "He is calm." Rachel pressed her lips together and looked down at Noah. The boy was holding something in his free hand. It was a short piece of straw that had been found caught in the cuff of his sweatshirt. Noah turned it between his fingers and asked, "Did that come from him?" Mason could not tell him for certain. There had been leaves and debris throughout the channel. He refused to turn uncertainty into a better story simply because everyone wanted one. "Maybe," he said. "We do know he heard something down there before we did." Noah considered that answer without speaking. Then he carefully tucked the straw beneath the adjustable band of his baseball cap instead of dropping it. Back inside, Atlas had moved away from the vent for the first time since entering the holding suite. He sat near the mesh where Mason usually conducted routine checks, calmly pulling apart a piece of lettuce. Claire noticed the change before Mason did. The constant searching had stopped. Atlas was no longer moving between the vent, the floor, and the door. Whatever had held his attention for so long was gone. Mason opened the connecting panel that allowed Atlas access to his regular indoor space. This time there was no hesitation. Atlas carried the yellow cup through first, set it near the doorway, then returned for the hollow tube. That small choice caught Mason unexpectedly. He turned his face away for a second and pretended to check the latch. Later, when the public area had emptied and the afternoon light stretched across the enclosure, Rachel and Noah were escorted past the viewing window on their way out. Atlas was sitting several yards inside with the cup between his hands. Noah stopped. Rachel did not pull him along. Through the glass, the boy lifted his crooked blue cap and held it against his chest. Atlas glanced toward the movement. There was no dramatic approach, no gesture anyone could translate with certainty. He simply remained there, quiet and attentive. Noah put the cap back on. The piece of straw was still tucked into the band. Mason stood a few feet behind them, watching Atlas watch the child who was going home, and for the first time. That day, nobody asked the gorilla to move. The next afternoon, Atlas returned to the outdoor habitat without hesitation. The maintenance equipment was gone, the temporary work area had been cleared, and a new secured cover sat over the drainage access beneath the grass. Mason expected Atlas to inspect it immediately. Instead, the silverback walked past the repaired section, gathered a handful of leafy greens, and settled beneath the shade structure where he usually ate. Mason stood near the service gate longer than necessary, listening to the ordinary sounds of the park return. Then Atlas paused, turned toward the repaired grate, and listened for several seconds. Finding nothing unusual, he went back to his greens. That simple choice brought Mason more relief than any report could have. Over the following days, the staff changed a few things that visitors probably never noticed. Maintenance marked the forgotten utility channel on the current site plans. Security added the construction barrier and storm drains to its walking checks. Claire placed a small note in Atlas's observation record describing how strongly he had responded to unusual sound and vibration. Mason added only one sentence beneath it: unusual attention should be observed before it is redirected. He did not write that Atlas had understood what was happening. Nobody could know that. But they had learned that dismissing an unfamiliar behavior too quickly could mean missing useful information. Atlas, meanwhile, returned to routines that suddenly felt different to the people watching him. He searched through cardboard enrichment boxes, separated celery leaves with careful fingers, and sometimes carried the yellow cup across the habitat before leaving it wherever he lost interest. Mason stopped assigning meaning to every movement. If anything, the experience had made him more patient with uncertainty. One morning Atlas sat beside the same concrete seam he had uncovered during the search. Mason noticed him touch it briefly, then move on. There was no hidden message this time, no emergency beneath the ground. Just a gorilla investigating his surroundings. Somehow, that mattered too. Rachel sent the park a short email several days later. Noah was home, sleeping normally again, though he had become unusually serious about keeping track of his blue baseball cap. Attached was a photograph of it resting on their kitchen counter. The little piece of straw was still tucked beneath the band. Mason printed the picture but did not display it for visitors. He placed it inside the staff office beside the daily observation clipboard, where the people who had been there that afternoon would understand it without explanation. A week later, Rachel asked whether Noah could visit again. Claire suggested keeping it quiet and brief, with no crowd and no expectation that Atlas would respond. On a cool weekday morning, Noah returned holding his mother's hand. He stopped farther from the glass than before. Atlas was across the habitat turning over a piece of bark. For several minutes, neither seemed interested in the other. Noah watched Atlas work through the grass, and the normality of it gradually softened his shoulders. Then Atlas carried the bark toward the shade and passed within view of the window. Noah raised one hand but did not touch the glass. Atlas paused for only a moment before continuing. Noah smiled anyway. Mason noticed that Rachel did too. There was something comforting in not needing a dramatic response. Before leaving, Noah took the straw from his cap and asked Mason whether Atlas should have it back. Mason considered the question, then shook his head gently. "I think you can keep that one." Noah returned it to the band. Outside, Atlas had settled into the grass with his back partly toward the window, relaxed enough to pay the visitors no attention at all. Rachel and Noah walked toward the exit while Mason remained behind. Just before they disappeared around the path, Noah turned once and looked back. Atlas was still beneath the shade structure, sunlight catching the silver across his back. The park had returned to an ordinary day, but the people who knew what had happened beneath that quiet patch of ground would never listen to ordinary sounds quite the same way again. 3 weeks later, the last temporary fence near the service corridor came down. Fresh gravel covered the place where the old storm drain had been exposed, and most visitors passed it without giving it a second glance. Mason still noticed it every time he crossed the walkway. On quiet afternoons, he sometimes remembered the hollow tapping beneath his feet and how easily it had disappeared beneath ordinary park noise. Atlas seemed to have moved on completely. He spent warm afternoons tearing leaves from branches, resting beneath the shade structure, and investigating whatever enrichment the keepers placed around the habitat. The yellow cup remained in rotation, scratched and faded now, no more important to Atlas than the other objects around him. Mason was glad they had not turned it into something ceremonial. It belonged where it had always belonged, with Atlas. Near the end of the month, an envelope arrived at the staff office addressed simply to the gorilla team. Inside was a photograph Rachel had taken at home. Noah was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, his blue baseball cap hanging from the back of his chair. The small piece of straw was still tucked beneath the adjustable band. On the back of the photograph, Noah had written a message in careful pencil, "Tell Atlas I am okay." Mason read it twice. Then he handed it to Claire without saying anything. She smiled, pressed the photograph flat where one corner had curled, and returned it to him. They decided not to put it on public display. Instead, Mason slipped it beneath the clear cover of the observation clipboard in the staff room. Days passed. Keepers recorded feeding times, enrichment choices, weather conditions, and small changes in behavior directly above that photograph. Noah slowly became part of the ordinary paperwork of caring for Atlas. In early fall, Rachel brought him back once more. There were no security officers waiting, no special arrangements beyond permission to visit during a quiet hour. Noah had grown comfortable enough to walk ahead of his mother, although he slowed when the gorilla habitat came into view. Atlas was sitting near a fallen log, pulling apart a cardboard box that held pieces of lettuce and carrot. Noah watched without speaking. Mason stayed several yards away. After a while, Noah removed his cap. The straw was gone. Rachel noticed Mason looking and explained that it had finally broken while Noah was playing outside. He had been upset for a few minutes, then placed the pieces in a little jar on his desk. Noah looked toward Atlas and shrugged in the practical way children sometimes do. "It was getting old," he said. Mason smiled. "Things do that." Atlas finished with the box and walked toward the far side of the habitat. As he passed the repaired drainage area, he slowed. Mason felt himself become attentive before he could stop it. Atlas touched the grass once, listened for perhaps a second, and continued walking. Nothing followed. No tapping. No radios. No hurried footsteps. Noah watched him disappear behind a stand of bamboo and then put his cap back on. He did not seem disappointed. On the way toward the exit, he reached for Rachel's hand without looking at her, and she closed her fingers around his. Mason remained by the viewing window until they were gone. Late that afternoon, after the visitors had left, he completed Atlas's final observation entry for the day. He wrote that Atlas had eaten normally, interacted with enrichment, and spent the afternoon resting. Nothing unusual observed. Mason closed the clipboard. Beneath the clear cover, Noah's photograph was still visible, with those 5 penciled words on the back known only to the staff. Outside, Atlas settled into the grass as the evening light crossed the habitat. The yellow cup lay a few feet away, upside down and empty. A breeze moved through the bamboo, and this time there was nothing beneath the ground that needed anyone's attention. Mason switched off the staff room light and quietly pulled the door closed. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.